In my last video, I spoke about what some researchers and even UN agencies like the WHO are describing as an epidemic of loneliness in the world today. And I expect that the details of that commentary might have been something of a surprise to some people, which is an indication that we're not really talking enough about it. But given the fact that younger generations are facing so much adversity in making friendships, building community, and especially in pairing off and finding options for marriage, it only makes what I want to talk about today that much more important. Because imagine if you were a young person today, and in spite of the fact that everything our culture indoctrinates you with and imposes on you, which then impairs your ability to find healthy romantic relationships, you actually manage to overcome that adversity and find someone who is willing to love you, yes, even you, with all of your charming defects. And not only that, you manage to get yourself set up with a stable enough domestic situation with a job and a home and a community that you feel confident that having children is something you're ready to begin doing. Again, something really difficult for young people to pull off and get into that position today. And then after overcoming all of the adversities that our insane culture throws at you, you discover that something isn't quite working, and then you end up getting diagnosed with something related to infertility. Like, as if there wasn't enough to overcome for young people today. Imagine having that thrown on top of it all. Think about how devastating that would be. And while I can't claim that experience as my own because God has blessed us with many children, I can say that I had a brief taste of that disappointment and grief in my own life. Because when my wife and I were first married, we started trying to have kids fairly early on, but it didn't seem to be happening. So we eventually went to a doctor who broke the news to us that it probably was never going to happen for us, or if it did, we would likely miscarry. And so for a time, we carried on with the expectation that we would never have children, and so we got a dog instead and poured ourselves into other endeavors. But not long after that, we discovered that we were pregnant, which came as a big surprise. And then so did our second child, not long after that. And then by the third, we figured, okay, these aren't flukes. We're actually fine, and there must have been some sort of misdiagnosis. But before those joys, I remember thinking this was a kind of grief that I couldn't share with many people. Everyone suffers other kinds of losses that are typically universal of the human experience, but this one isn't. And I wonder if there's more we can do to be more conscious of those who are suffering from it. And I get why in a culture that glamorizes individualism, materialism, and sterility, people would be indifferent at best towards the suffering imposed by infertility. But in the church, we should be responding to those couples in a more loving way, eager to integrate them into community and into family life. And as I thought about that, it reminded me of something I learned not too long ago about the old days, something I found kind of curious about the old days. Because have you ever noticed in historical novels or movies, there's often a character known as and referred to as the widow so-and-so, like the widow Jane or something like that. Like that was their title. That always struck me as strange or even cruel if you think about it. Why would you find it necessary to persistently remind them of their grief? Why does that state of loneliness and loss need to define them with every reference? And I thought, well, surely we've become a more compassionate society since then, and that's why we don't do it anymore. But then I found out later that it was actually an honorific title. It was an explicit recognition by society that the widow is someone who has faced one of the most difficult forms of suffering and loss in this life, and that they should be honored for their courage and perseverance as they continue to be a part of and integrate into the community. It was also a continual reminder for the community that they owed the widow honor, respect, but also support, affection, and solidarity to whatever degree it could be provided. Now, I'm not trying to say that I think that couples struggling with infertility need to be given a title, but I wonder if as a church we can be more mindful of their particular kind of suffering and find meaningful ways to love and include them. And I think as Catholics who tend to have larger families, this is probably something that we should be a little extra attentive to and sensitive to. I remember reading a study once about how the absence of material wealth can be more distressing relative to the community that you find yourself living in. What they found is that if you are at a particular economic bracket that is generally on the low side, but that is relatively the same as your neighbors, so everyone around you is in basically the same economic situation, it won't tend to bother you that much. But if you transplant that person or a family to a wealthier community, then the distress of their economic situation will become much more psychologically acute. And I imagine for Catholics struggling with infertility, it's probably that much more difficult when you're surrounded by large families in your community, which is why we who are part of those large families should be extra vigilant and sensitive to their need to be loved, included, and supported. One aspect of community life I might draw our attention to is the way that parents with large families tend to consolidate their commitments, which is certainly something that we as parents do. So for example, we tend to enroll our kids in a lot of the same kinds of activities, because if we didn't, we'd be headed in 10 different directions on a daily basis. So if one kid's doing piano, they're all doing piano, whether they like it or not. We don't have some doing piano, some violin, some dance, etc., because it's literally untenable. And we also tend to do this with our social lives. We spend time with other families with a similar number of kids at a similar age intervals as our kids, because again, we just don't have the capacity for everyone to be headed off in different directions for different social engagements. But as we do so, I think we need to be attentive to the fact that couples without kids are potentially falling through the cracks, and that it would take so little effort to invite them to nights when we're hosting other families. That's a simple example of the kinds of things that we can be doing, but I think as we become more attentive to this, and that's the whole point of this commentary, is that I want us to draw our attention to it, I think we can find other ways to better integrate them and support them. The last thing I want to talk about is a thought that my wife and I started asking ourselves and each other after we were told that we couldn't have any kids. It was on the question of adoption, and there was an especially difficult question that occurred to us that we didn't have any easy answers for, which was, could we love someone else's biological child with the same intensity that we would naturally have for our own biological children, which does come much more naturally. And that question was left unanswered because before we could explore the possibility of adoption, we got pregnant. And forgive me if this sounds overly sentimental. I mean, you can take it or leave it for what it is. But another question that occurred to me, and probably will to other people of prayer who experience infertility or other forms of loss, is the intense desire to want to know why God chose this particular cross for me. And of course, this isn't always the case, but from some of the couples I've known who have carried this cross with humility and fidelity, there have been times where I've been struck with the impression that they would make just incredible parents if given the chance, probably much better parents than the rest of us who begrudgingly thank God for the little dictators that now run our lives. And that's a much more difficult observation to reconcile with God's providence. Of all the people who should be parents, why choose like this particular couple to carry this burden? And an answer that has occurred to me in some of those cases was because they're the kinds of people who have so much love to give that an adopted child who needs them to be their parents is going to never doubt that they are as loved by them as if they were their own biological children. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.